One of the most important yet undervalued skills of leaders is listening. Today we're going to talk about listening, the value and how to do it better, how to listen like you mean it. Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. Are you ready? Let's go.
Welcome to the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. We are here each week to help you lead more confidently and make a bigger difference, both professionally and personally. This episode is sponsored by From Manager to Remarkable Leader, Kevin's flagship workshop based on his proven leadership model. Learn more at remarkablepodcast.com/manager. And now here's your host, Kevin.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast. And it's remarkable today because we're talking about a skill that is important to us in every area of our lives. I have long said that when we are a better leader, we become a better human, and vice versa. And our topic today is timely, it's important, and it's foundational. And I'm excited to have our guest with you. Let me introduce you to her. Hardest part of the whole episode for Kevin is right now. Let me introduce my guest to you. Her name is Ximena Vengoechea. Yeah, I was close. She is a user researcher, writer, and illustrator whose work on personal and professional development has been published in Inc., The Washington Post, Newsweek, and the Huffington Post. She is a contributor at Fast Company and The Muse, and is best known for her project, The Life Audit. Her brand new book is titled Listen Like You Mean It, Reclaiming the Lost Art of True Connection. An experienced manager, mentor, and researcher in the tech industry, she's previously worked at Pinterest, LinkedIn, and Twitter. She currently lives in San Francisco with her husband, Isaac, her son, and their dog. And she's our guest today. Ximena, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is a pleasure. So that's an interesting sort of description of yourself. User researcher, writer, illustrator. So like you didn't wake up when you were 5 and said, I want to be a user researcher, writer, and illustrator. Probably. Maybe an illustrator. I don't know. So tell us a little bit about how you ended up doing the work that you do. Just tell us a little bit about your journey, if you would.
Yeah, sure. So when I was little, I definitely didn't know that user researcher was even a role.
I'm not sure I still do. I know researcher, but anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. And I didn't actually discover that role until after college. I sort of stumbled into it. I studied literature and art history in college and had a stint in France where I was learning French and working at a gallery. I had thought at the time I wanted to be a professor, do the academia thing. And I did that for a little bit and then very quickly realized that I did not want to be in a library all day. That I could do it, but I wasn't that excited about it. And I ended up being drawn into the tech world. I was really interested in what was happening there. It felt like the kind of place that was moving quickly, where I could learn on the go. I've always had a little bit of a sort of entrepreneurial streak to me. And so I was drawn in for that reason. And my first job in tech was at a tiny, tiny startup where I was one of 8 people who basically was doing everything non-technical. And that was where I was first exposed to user research. And it was interesting to me because I like to think of it as one of the most people-focused roles in tech. You think of technology and it's like, we're coding, we're moving pixels, and
right.
There's the product, there's what you're
by the way, there's
with.
a user on the other end of that screen, right?
Exactly. And so that's what I was interested in. I was interested in the people and why they use certain products or why they don't use certain products, or what their routines are, what their perceptions are, what their needs are. And I think, any manager will probably say, oh, that I'm interested in people too, for many of the same reasons. It's not necessarily about product, but you're interested in what makes someone tick and how do they do their best work. And so for me, being a user researcher allowed me to explore some of those questions in completely different contexts, where I got to study things like how people cook, or how reporters tell stories with social media, or how people think about their next career change. And so it was a very exciting role for me to really get to dive into the people side of technology. And eventually I moved into a management role where I, was coaching other researchers in how to do that as well.
So if people are paying attention and listening, and I hope that they are, they may be starting to get the connection between being the researcher, the kind of research that you've done, and listening. So I've got two questions that kind of go together. So I'm just going to give you both and then let you take it however you want. Okay. So I'd love to know more about how you came to write the book, but I'm guessing in there's, what do you see as the connection between listening and your work in user research?
Yeah, so, and those are definitely related questions. So thank you for that. So when I began my training as a researcher, so much of what you're doing is you're interviewing people, like you're interviewing me, or I might be observing someone, or maybe hosting a workshop, to understand some of those things that I was mentioning earlier, their needs, their motivations, or just how they interact with the product. Like literally, what do you do if I ask you to navigate to Gmail and fish up, an email? Like how easy is that for you, right? And in that training, you learn to structure a conversation. You learn to ask questions that are open-ended, that allow people to go to where they need to go. And it's really important in user research. There's actually a lot at stake, because if I accidentally or intentionally lead you to a particular response, then the data is effectively useless. So I can't end a study and say, well, everybody, liked this thing about this product because I led you there, right? That wouldn't be, it would create a bad product experience. So the training is really, it's a lot about asking good questions and about listening. And as I got deeper into that training, it just became very clear to me that those lessons could be easily applied to the real world, that they didn't have to
You
be.
mean you're talking to people about how they're going to use things in the real world naturally, right? That would make sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds so obvious, but not everybody, does that. And to me, it just seemed very clear that what we were doing inside of a lab with a mirror, with a team behind the back observing, could find its own way in the real world with a little bit of a modification. And so I started thinking about that. And maybe, I don't know, 10 years ago at this point, I wrote a blog post about it. And that one kind of went viral. And I kind of set it aside. And I think my brain was kind of still working on it for a while, so that by the time I realized, oh, I have more to say about this topic, and started working on the book, it kind of just poured out. I think I was very lucky in that regard, where I had a lot to say.
You had been writing the book through your work for a long time. I know a little bit about how that part works, right? So it doesn't take that long to write it because it was really already there. Fair?
Yes, totally fair. Exactly right.
Cool. So one of the interesting things about listening is that, and I've helped, in workshops of different sorts, we've had lots of conversations about listening, and lots of people have asked me about it. And some days I think I'm good at it, and many days I know I'm not, and all those things. But one of the things that I've observed is that everyone says, yeah, listening's important. But then ask them if they're any good at it. And most people are like, well, don't know if I am or not. One of the things I love about this book, and again, we are talking about the brand new book, and I'll get the title right since I don't have a copy in front of me. Listen Like You Mean It, reclaiming the lost art of true connection. And so I guess my question is, everyone says, well, good listener, great listener. You talk about levels of listening, and we'll get there. But the first thing that you talk about is what I love, this way of talking about it: surface listening. And I think that's where a lot of us are most of the time, a lot of the time. So what do you mean by that? And can you and describe that a little bit for us?
Yeah, surface listening is definitely where we are when we're on default, when we're not paying attention. So that's where you might be catching literally what's been said, but you're not catching the meaning behind what's been said, or the emotion behind what's been said. Surface listening is what we use when we're tired at the end of a long day and our spouse says something and we say, uh-huh, but we're not actually listening. It's what we say when we sit down to a one-on-one with a direct report, but we're still thinking about something that happened in a previous meeting. So you're kind of tracking. I mean, you're not totally tuned out. Sometimes you are. I mean, I would say that's just not listening as opposed to even surface listening. But you're kind of tracking enough to sort of be polite and keep things moving along, but you're not really gathering much meaning or certainly the emotion behind what's been said, which is what I'm particularly interested in.
And that's what we should all be interested in hearing. Quite honestly, we don't need to spend any more time on that because we already know how that works. We're all pretty good at that. So let's talk about, so when you talk about levels of listening, how do we move up from that? And how would you define or describe the movement from that sort of basic surface listening to something deeper, to something more powerful, to something more connected?
Yeah, so the place that the book tries to chart that path into this sort of deeper level is what I call empathetic listening. And that's where you're really tracking what the other person is experiencing, including their emotions. And one of the first ways to do that, and the book kind of outlines many of these techniques, but one of the first ways to do that is to bring into conversation what I call a listening mindset. And that's where you're coming in with the intention to be present, to stay absorbed, to understand what the other person is experiencing. And there are sort of three qualities that I outline in the book as part of that mindset. One is bringing humility in. So I can't do a good job of listening if I assume I have the right answer, or if I'm bringing judgment into what you're saying. It will be very, very hard for me to connect with you if I bring those things in. So you want to bring humility in. Curiosity is another important trait for a listening mindset. If I assume that, I have all the answers already, I'm an expert in that, I don't need to get curious about what you're saying. Again, it will be difficult to connect. And then empathy. And empathy is really that human to human connection of really understanding what is this person experiencing in the moment? What emotions are they calling on? Even if I'm not familiar with your particular experience, maybe I have something similar that I can relate to in some way so that I can sense into how you're feeling.
That's, I think this book, there's a lot of great things about this book. And there's a lot for us all to learn from it, in my opinion. But if all you left with as a listener right now, everybody, is the idea that it's not about good listening or great listening. It's not even about active listening, because active listening, fine and dandy, but it's fundamentally about something that I'm doing. But I love this idea of empathetic listening. First of all, that I believe as leaders, we've got to become more empathetic. But I think that frames what this is in such a more powerful way. So I really appreciate you sort of bringing that approach or bringing that language to this activity that we all need to get better at. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's really easy to miss. I think we're particularly in our culture, which is very productivity driven and very output focused and like check the next thing off the list. It's easy to kind of fall into that pattern of go, go, go and forget that there's a person in front of you who has all sorts of things that they're dealing with that may be coming up in conversation and may even explain like, oh, why they don't want to take on that task, or why they're not giving you that project update. Maybe they're being forgetful, or maybe they're feeling insecure, maybe there's baggage from a project that you need to unpack. So yeah, I think it's really important.
And we've been saying for months, and hopefully we'll finish by talking a little bit about sort of the remote world and how that all relates to all this. But as folks who've been spending lots of time helping people with remote work, and and by the way, everybody, this episode is brought to you by The Long Distance Teammate, our new book. And in The Long Distance Teammate, we talk about the idea of moving from transaction to interaction, and that's what you're describing. Ximena, you're talking about this idea of we got to get past just doing the work and yes, sir, and yes, ma'am, and yeah, I got it, and get beyond that to interaction, to empathy. So I just want to highlight for everyone who's listening or even watching us, those three things about the listening mindset. If you're a leader, if you get better at humility, curiosity, and empathy, you're not just going to be a better listener. You're going to be a better leader. And so I really, really appreciate that. So in the book, you spend a whole section in the book talking about the conditions that we need to place ourselves in, the conditions for successful listening. 3 of those as well. I'd like you to talk about those. And then there's one of them, probably won't surprise you which one, that I'd really like us to talk a little bit more about. But go ahead. What are the conditions that we got a mindset, but now what are the conditions that we need to set in order for us to be empathetic listeners?
Yeah, so some of those conditions are staying present, which I mentioned earlier, being really keen observers of what's happening. And by keen observers, I mean, you're focusing on what the other person is saying. You're focusing on how they're saying it, their voice and tone. You're focusing on their posture, their body language, right? So those are some of the areas that are really important to understand. If you can't stay present in a conversation, obviously it's going to be very difficult to hear and internalize what the other person is saying and meaning.
Read impossible, everybody. Impossible.
Yes.
We're being very nice, but listen, if we're not really present, there's no way we're very far past surface listening, right? We're just not.
Yeah. And I think this is intuitive to us. I think a lot of us know that we have shorter attention spans than we used to because we've got these lovely devices that are attached to our hip or frozen to our hand pretty much wherever we go with our smartphones. Yeah, we've got like little phone claws that have formed. So, I don't think anyone will be surprised by that, but I think staying present actually goes far beyond just putting your phone away, although that is an excellent first step. A lot of what happens when you're not present is that you are elsewhere, right? Like your mind starts running on a set of chores or tasks or action items, whatever, that just have come up. Something the other person has said has prompted an idea or sparked some inspiration or just reminded you that you forgot to, feed the cat before you whatever. And I think so much of staying present is really tuning into what's happening up here, what's happening in my mind, and then what's happening in my body as well. Sometimes it's easier for us to track what's happening in our body than in our minds. And you can feel if you're starting to get tense in a conversation. Maybe it's a performance conversation or something. Maybe you have to deliver bad news. You can feel it in your body. And so it's important to be kind of constantly tracking what's happening in your body and then where your mind is going so that you can be intentional about bringing yourself back to the present and saying, oh, that's my mind wandering. Okay, let me bring it back, and just naming it as you observe it can be sufficient to bring you back to the present.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so good. I was thinking something that was sparked for me as you were talking about that is a person who's been a guest here before, Mara Thomas. She and I had a conversation. She's a productivity expert. She and I had a conversation where she talked about some research that said that if your phone is in the same room as you, that it's taking some of your attention. Now, I don't go that far, like when I'm here in the office, but I do go so far as whenever possible to not have it in my line of sight, like it's out here. And because clearly when it's in our line of sight, we start looking at it, we start picking it up and all that stuff. I think you're right on. And it's not the only challenge we have here, but it's certainly one of them. You talk about, and you've talked around this, but I want to dive right into, like, if we're going to be present, we have to be paying attention, right, to the other person. And I mean, you talked about paying attention to our bodies, but how do we maintain our attention on the other person? What's your advice there?
Yeah, this is a great question, and I think some of us are naturally able to focus more than others, but there are certainly ways to combat this. I think one of the best ways to approach this is to understand what are your personal conditions for staying present. So I'll give a couple of examples.
Mm-hmm.
Some people find great energy from being in a crowded space, right? Like from being in a coffee shop during a meeting. There's something about the ambiance that actually gives them more energy and allows them to focus more on their conversation partner. For other people, that same environment is incredibly distracting and they wish they could be in a quieter space. Yeah, there you go. Right. So there are things like that, which seem a little bit silly or, like a luxury to think about, but it actually, when you set up your environment in a way that is supportive to you when you're able to, because we can't control every conversation, but if you at least know those things about yourself, it's super helpful because then you can either design the environment to support you, or if you can't, then you know that going into it. And so you can kind of prepare yourself in advance and say, okay, I'm going to be going into this kind of setting, or I'm going to be having this kind of conversation. I know I tend to tune out when I hear topics like XYZ.
Yep.
You've said it, you've internalized it, you can then set yourself up a little bit better for success. So a lot of it, and I think this is true of listening in general, even beyond staying present, so much of it is really understanding yourself in order to be there for the other person.
One of the things I guess I'll have to say, in a pre and post pandemic world, when some of my team was here in this office with me, oftentimes as a leader, someone will come into your office and they'll sit across the desk from you. And I know that that's not the best place if I want to listen and I want to focus on them. So across this room, there are 2 chairs. They're comfortable chairs. They actually recline. And I'm not saying that necessarily we need to recline, but I know that I'll listen better if we go to those chairs than if I stay here. And I know I'll be better if I sit in one of those chairs versus the other. And so that's a situation that I can control. And I did it and will do it again regularly because it makes a difference for me. I've learned that. And it's about attention, to your very point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And for some people, it's taking a walk with someone else and having a walking one-on-one. And then there's also, I would say, even beyond kind of designing these settings, there's things like having an important conversation on a full stomach instead of an empty one, or, getting all the sleep that you need. I mean, we laugh, right? But it's true. If you've ever been in a conversation and been hungry or not caffeinated or whatever that may be, staying present is so hard as it is. We want to do everything that we can to set ourselves up for success.
Yeah, what you're saying is when we to really be present, we need to be at our best. And so think about what we need to do to be at our best, right? That's what
Exactly.
I'm hearing you say. And don't underestimate those things. I mean, I chuckled along with you when you talked about food. Like, this isn't the Remarkable Food Network channel or something like that. But there's truth. There's absolute truth in what you're saying. There's another thing in the book that I wanted us, and I, as I was preparing for this conversation, I was thinking, well, this could easily be 2 hours. Well, you probably don't want to spend 2 hours, but I know there's at least 2 hours worth of stuff that we could talk about that I would love for us to talk about and that people would benefit from. But there's something that you talked about that really struck me as profoundly true. And that was this area of default listening modes. And there's a bunch of them, and we don't have time to unpack them all. But everyone, as you're listening to this, think about your default listening modes and think about what is your default listening mode as a leader and a coach, because you may discover a blind spot. And because it's a blind spot you didn't know you had, you may discover something in the next 5 minutes about yourself. So how's that for a setup? Like, now you better be good. But seriously, talk about default listening modes for a bit.
Yes, I think these are so interesting. So default listening modes, this is how we naturally show up in conversation. So each of us has a way of being in conversation, a type of listening that we tend to do. And it's really ingrained in us. So we do it without thinking. It may have developed based on, how we grew up, our childhood environment. It may have developed based on what's been rewarded in the past, so behaviors that have been rewarded, lots of inputs along the way, but it's very, very natural to us. We probably don't even notice we're doing it. So some examples of that, because I think this will help kind of listeners picture themselves in
Absolutely.
this.
Yeah.
A problem solver. So a problem solver comes into every conversation listening for, not thinking about it intuitively, just instinctively listening for problems. So let's say they're a manager and a direct report comes and says, I have so much work on my plate. A problem solver might hear that and say, oh, okay, we got to take something off this person's plate. They're drowning. Let me move things around and help them. I'm helping them by solving this problem. However, the other person, the direct report, might have just been providing an update. Maybe they were going to say, I have so much work on my plate, I can handle it. Or I have so much work on my plate. And they meant, I want you to know how hard I'm working and see that. Like, I don't need any help. I'm just providing an update. Right. So if you go into problem solving listening mode in that scenario, and your direct report is just providing an update, well, now it seems like you are micromanaging potentially. You're maybe taking away a project that, yes, they have a lot on their plate, but they were really enjoying that. Maybe they love being busy, or it was a stretch opportunity, whatever the case may be. But so that's one example of bringing in a listening mode, and you're just automatically filtering the conversation through that mode. No
So,
mode is bad, by the way, but we have to be able to adapt it and apply it to the right situation.
and the thing I want to say to everyone who's listening is, if and there's 7, 8, 9 more that we could talk about, but I'm really glad you started with that one, because oftentimes as a leader, so as you just heard that, everybody, it's sort of like knowing both sides of the, being the third party. You can see that in almost every case, that person who brings that default listening mode of being a problem solver, their intention is good. Their intention is genuine. Their intention is for everyone's benefit. Doesn't always mean it will be seen that way, or even be effective in that way. And that's why I think they're so important. So many of these modes, there's nothing wrong with them in and of themselves, but when they are automatic, default, to your point, then we find ourselves, without knowing, maybe not having the impact, or being misinterpreted without even knowing we're being misinterpreted.
Yeah, exactly. And so the book outlines the modes, but it also has an exercise so that you can kind of go through and identify which mode you are. Because with that, then again, you have that knowledge about yourself. You can say, okay, this is what I tend to do. So now when I'm in conversation, I can be aware of that and just ask myself if there's another mode that might be more helpful in this scenario.
Yeah, anytime we take something that's automatic or subconscious and have a clue to make it conscious, then we can make a choice, right? Maybe problem solving is what's needed right now. Maybe efficiency is what's needed right now, whatever. But the reality is, if we can do something, and the exercise is fantastic to help us make it more conscious, become more aware about that. That's really, really excellent. Like I said, there's so much that we could talk about, and I would love to do that. But I before we go, I have to do this. So now we're having fewer and fewer conversations, in the office in the two comfy chairs, and more of the conversations like you and I are having it right now on Zoom or WebEx or Teams. It doesn't matter. So what is your thought about listening? I mean, we've done it with the phone a lot in our past,
Mm-hmm.
right? But we haven't done it like this, except for the last few months, really, most of us. What is your advice about listening on a webcam?
Yeah, very present these days, very, very relevant. The first thing I would say is just to think about what kind of conversation you're going to have and whether you need to do it with a webcam. I think we have gotten very accustomed to this shift to remote and automatically saying, okay, let's pop the video on. And sometimes that's helpful, but other times maybe actually it is more helpful to go back to the phone and not have video on. Maybe we can duplicate those really productive walking one-on-ones we used to have by each, grabbing our phone, putting on a mask and heading outside and getting some exercise at the same time. Since we are all very stir crazy, maybe that would actually boost the conversation. Or maybe you do need the video on because you're going to have a serious conversation where you want to understand, the person's facial reactions, what's happening for them. So I would just say, like, as a very first step, just to question whether or not you need video for a call and whether it's going to give you something more or take something away from the conversation.
I think that's so right. I mean, we'll put a note in the show notes, everybody. I wrote an article a while back that was basically the forgotten tool. The forgotten communication tool, and it is the phone, and not the phone for an app. It's the phone for a phone call, conversation, right? I think you're exactly right, and I think you hit the nail on the head at the start, which is think about this conversation and what do we need for this conversation. I think that's really great. It's really great. 4 more questions. One last one about the book. You talk about something called listener's drain. I know that you and I have both experienced it. So what do you mean by that? Because people might not realize or may have a feeling and not know where it's coming from. What do you mean by listener's drain?
Yes. So listener's drain is what happens when you've had some very intense listening experiences. So you may feel this way after a good interview where you're constantly listening for what the person is saying and where you want to take the conversation. You might also feel this in, let's say, an intense conversation with a direct report. Again, it could be a performance conversation where you're really trying to track what the other person is experiencing. How's this landing? How are they taking it? I always feel it at the end of a day of research sessions where I've spent, 5 hours talking to people, and more than talking, listening to people. And I just feel exhausted. For me, it's something I feel in my body. I feel very tired. I feel like I have a head cold. I feel very antisocial. I don't want to talk to anyone, so everybody has their own version of this, but it's natural. And I would say it's a sign of really good listening at play. But it does mean that we need to take care of ourselves and recognize when we're feeling that way, and maybe don't try and push through that next conversation. Say, I'm going to get all these tough conversations done in one day. Well, okay, maybe you can do a couple on a Tuesday and a few more on a Wednesday so that you don't overdo it. Because when you do overdo it, you become super ineffective at listening anyway, and it's painful for you. So nobody really wins in that scenario. And so the last part of the book looks at listener's drain and what are some of the tactics that we can do to kind of help ourselves recover.
Perfect. So, all right. Enough about the book, enough about listening. What do you do for fun?
For fun, I read and I draw. Those are 2 things that I find to be pretty relaxing that I can get lost in. I think some other things are, you kind of start them in fits and starts, but reading I can really just like go all in on, and drawing I find to be very meditative. Even if I never share it with anybody, I can just kind of just look at the pretty colors. And I also am taking walks with my son. I have a 16-month-old and my dog, and just kind of getting outside is nice too.
The walks will soon be both of you walking, and you'll be trying to keep up if you're not.
Oh, he's been walking for 6 months.
I was gonna
so
say,
he's
yeah,
like now getting on running.
So yeah, exactly. You've got a dog and a boy to keep up with.
Yeah.
For a long time to come. So speaking of reading, what are you reading these days?
So right now I am a few chapters into this like wonderfully escapist book, which is by Becky Cooper. who's a dear friend of mine from college, who wrote We Keep the Dead Close. And it's about a murder at Harvard, and it's sort of a investigative, reported / slightly memoiristic. It kind of blends these genres, and it's great. It has nothing to do with business or day job type of stuff, and sometimes you need that. There are times where I feel like I have a lot of energy to learn more and more and more skills, and then there are other times where I just want to not think about anything for a little bit and kind of get lost in somebody else's story. And that's definitely where I am right now.
We keep the dead close. Perfect.
Mhm.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. So now the question you've most wanted me to ask from the very beginning. Where can people learn more about the book? Where can they learn more about you? Where do you want to point people? Here's the chance to tell folks how they can stay connected to you.
Great. Yeah. So you can learn more about the book on my website, which is my first name, last name.com, XimenaVengoechea.com /books. And you can also sign up for my newsletter there, Ximena.substack.com. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about what's happening in the tech space and careers and creativity, those are some of the topics that I tend to talk about. And I'm all over the internet. So if you Google me, you'll find me.
That's true. You will. And we'll put all that in the show notes for you all, everybody. And so before we go, I have a question for all of you who are watching or listening. And the question is, now what? What are you going to do with this? Like, it's one thing to nod your head and say, man, that was really good. Default listening modes. I get it. One thing to say, yeah, I need to be more present. Like, what are you going to do? And so the challenge for all of us isn't just to be entertained by this or be inspired by this even, or be informed by this, but rather to take action as a result of it. And both Ximena and I will be happier if you take action than if you just say, yep, that was good. Next podcast. So I hope that you will do that. I hope you will always do that when you listen to any, not if you're listening to an escapist podcast, I suppose, right? But if you're listening to something that's business or personal or professional development related, I hope that you're always asking yourself that question. Now, what? And that's why I ask you all that question every single week. So Ximena, thank you so much for being here. It was a pleasure to have you. Such a pleasure to have you. I was looking forward to it, and you didn't disappoint. How about that?
Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. And I loved the question. So thank you.
You're welcome. So everybody, this episode was brought to you by our brand new book, The Long Distance Teammate. Stay engaged and connected while working anywhere. You can learn more. You can get an excerpt. You can find out how to get your own copy by going to longdistanceteammate.com. I hope you'll do that. And I hope you'll be back next week right here for another episode of the Remarkable Leadership Podcast.